Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Thank you for joining us. Actress Lori Loughlin has been sentenced to 2 months in prison, given a $150,000 fine, and must perform 100 hours of community service for her role in the college admission scandal. Earlier today, a judge sentenced her husband, Mossimo Giannulli, to 5 months in prison for his role in the scam. The couple initially pleaded not guilty after prosecutors say the couple paid $500,000 to gain their daughter's admission to the University of Southern California as rowing recruits. But back in May, the pair struck a plea deal and admitted to conspiracy to commit wire and mail fraud. CBS News legal analyst Rikki Klieman joins me now to discuss. Hi, Rikki. Great to see you. So, Lori Loughlin, TV star, she was one of the most recognizable names involved in this college admissions scandal, and she was initially somewhat defiant in the face of the charges against her. So, Rikki, can you tell us more about the details of her sentencing, and is this what you expected?
The only reason I expected it is because of the plea deal itself. What you had was the government filing an 8-page memorandum for sentencing purposes, which actually looked like it had been filed by the defense, because it was a very defensive argument about why she should only get 2 months and her husband should only get 5 months. And what the prosecution in making this deal was attempting to do with a very tough sentencing judge in Judge Gorton was to say, look, Your Honor, it's time. They finally accepted responsibility. We have to all recognize that they did this. And let's look at the other defendants in the college admissions scandal and see what they got. And therefore, we can fit in Lori Loughlin and Mossimo Giannulli. I've rarely seen a government sentencing memorandum that looked this defensive. I think both sides were scared that this judge was not going to accept the plea agreement.
And Giannulli, Loughlin's husband, received 5 months in prison for his role in all of this, while she received only 2. Why did he get a longer sentence?
As it turns out, much of the evidence that you could point to, which had to do with transcripts of telephone calls, voicemails, emails, conversations that other people reported, it looks certainly like Mossimo Giannulli, the husband of Lori Loughlin, was much further involved than she was. In fact, at the sentencing this morning, Judge Gorton chastised the husband for saying that he had been the leader and he had really caused shame to fall upon his wife as well as his 2 daughters.
And Rikki, you mentioned earlier that there were some doubts as to whether this plea deal would be accepted. Can you delve into that a little bit more? Why were both sides worried about that?
I think in this case, it is a fair assessment on the part of legal experts to say that both sides were concerned. All of the attention in this case, no matter how many defendants were involved, when we're looking at lots and lots and lots of parents, as well as the athletic coaches and people who worked at the university, was that Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin were the 2 bold-faced names. Felicity Huffman was the model defendant. She accepted responsibility, showed remorse. She was ashamed from the very beginning. She got to the courthouse through her lawyers very quickly. She worked out a plea deal, and she did her 14 days in prison really fast. So on the other side of this was Lori Loughlin and her husband, who were, as you described in the introduction, defiant. They acted as if they were going to take every reasonable possibility that they could to delay these proceedings, to put forth motions which they are entitled to do and should do if, in fact, the motions were viable and not frivolous, but that they were not going to accept responsibility. There were pictures, of course, film when Lori Loughlin went to the courthouse with her husband pre-pandemic days, and she was smiling. She had landed in Boston at the airport. She was signing autographs. It looked like she did not take any of this very seriously. Whether she did or not may be irrelevant. irrelevant because it was the appearance of being a flippant defendant, if you will. So by the time that she and her husband decided that they were going to accept responsibility, plead guilty, and work out a plea deal, this was so much later than when this case originally started. Now, if you had a different judge who wasn't known as a tough sentencing judge, as Judge Gorton is, that perhaps people would have thought, well, okay, it's a plea agreement. Prosecution and defense agree. Of course, a judge will accept it. But this judge is a very firm, by the way, and fair judge. And he believes in the idea of consistency in a case. And that was the biggest factor that the prosecution and the defense had to be able to get this sentence at this time. This is a situation where if they had continued to be defiant and there had been no pandemic, there might not indeed have been acceptance of this plea deal.
So, Rikki, you mentioned the pandemic. How did it play a role in the couple's sentencing? Was the delay good for them overall?
Well, it really was good for them in the end. And people who know me on CBS News know that one of my phrases is, the first person to the courthouse gets the best deal. And that's because of years of practicing law in the trenches, that if you're going to accept responsibility, you better get there early, because the first person in always will derive a benefit. The more that you stay out, the more recalcitrant that you are, then the prosecution gets upset, because the prosecution has to keep doing more and more work and answering more and more motions, more and more briefs filed. And the prosecution has the right, which they did here, of going forward, adding additional charges, making the possible punishment in the event of a guilty finding, whether by plea or by trial, to be much greater than the people who came in early. So delay was not to their advantage. But because of the pandemic, two things happened. Across the country, if you look at both in the courthouse and in the prison, first of all, people were being let out of prison by virtue of COVID. And you had people who had done things that were more violent. This is, by anyone's estimation, it's a white-collar crime. You also had people who had done things that did not seem as egregious as Lori Loughlin and Mossimo Giannulli, and they were getting out. Then you had people who had done things that were more egregious, and they were getting out. The second part of this is not only people being let out of prison because of COVID, but it started to happen that in the state courts, not the federal courts, but in the state courts across the country, everything was getting slower and slower, and people who were violent criminals were not doing serious time. So in the scheme of things, Lori Loughlin and Mossimo Giannulli really reaped the benefit of the pandemic, which lessened punishments across the board.
Rikki Klieman, once again, thank you so much for sharing your legal expertise with us. Great to see you.
Nice to see you, Tanya.